Hello class, I am Connor, and today we're going to be going over the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most important events in the entire Cold War. It probably is the most famous, and it's probably the most important. So, the Cold War, if you guys don't know what the Cold War is, the Cold War, because it wasn't an actual war, it was just a series of conflicts between the US and the Soviet Union in a very large time period. It was probably the worst in the 60s, around this area. Like, this is probably the height of it. But it lasted a long time. It lasted from 1947 to 1991, which is crazy to think about. Like, this conflict lasted from basically the end of World War II. I know World War II ended a little bit before that, but it's close, to the fall of the Iron Curtain and the fall of the Soviet Union itself. So it started basically in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion. If you guys don't know what the Bay of Pigs invasion is, so it was when the U.S. tried to overthrow the government in Cuba. So we'll talk about why they wanted to. So Cuba became allies with the Soviet Union, and in this era, the Soviet Union was trying to spread communism. The U.S. was deathly afraid of it. In McCarthyism in the 50s, I mean, there was witch hunts for communists in the U.S. They'd be getting thrown in jail. They'd be getting killed. I mean, it was crazy. So, the U.S. hated communism and would stop at nothing to stop the spread of it. That was the U.S.'s main goal in the post-World War II era, to stop the spread of communism. And the Soviet Union, their goal was to spread communism. They thought it was the best. I don't know if their citizens thought that, but the higher-ups thought it was the best. So the Bay of Pigs invasion, the U.S. wanted to stop communism from spreading this is close. Cuba is close to the United States of America. Like, Florida, like, it's only like 90 miles, I believe, from Florida to Cuba, from the mainland. So the U.S. could not have the communists right there, very close to their soil. It got them nervous, and they needed to put a stop to it. They couldn't stand for it. President John F. Kennedy, I mean, he could not see the U.S. be that close to the communists of Cuba. So the U.S., they formulated this plan. They wanted to use Cuba exiles and people who just wanted to leave Cuba anyway, like people who got thrown out or people who wanted to look for a better opportunity, who came to the U.S. looking for a better chance, capitalism, instead of the horrors of the communist regime in Cuba at that point. So their plan was to send these people back to Cuba to try and overthrow the government, and it seemed like a good enough idea. I mean, it seemed like it could have worked, but unfortunately, to make a long story short, it did not work at all. I mean, the Cuban exiles were just killed. They were captured. I mean, it did not work. The U.S.'s plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion failed miserably, and it's unfortunate. That could have stopped this entire conflict from happening, but it could have led to a larger conflict if the U.S. did succeed. So now we'll fast forward to 1962. Actually, no, we'll backtrack for a minute. So the Russian leader, Khrushchev, could not have the U.S. invading Cuba like that. He could not stand to see his ally getting invaded by the U.S. here. So he thought of an idea. So in the period between 1961 and October of 1962, he formulated an idea to put missiles into Cuba, nuclear missiles into Cuba. The U.S. had missiles in Turkey, in southern Italy, and maybe a few other places, but that's not confirmed. And the Soviets knew that. So basically, the Soviets were like just basically trying to get even. The U.S. has missiles pointed probably right towards St. Petersburg, Moscow. So the Soviets wanted missiles pointed towards, Florida's the closest, maybe like Miami, but I don't know how far the missiles could have gone. I mean, maybe they could have gone all the way up to New York City. Who knows? But the U.S. could not have that. The U.S. could not have that problem. Like, they did not want any nuclear missiles anywhere near their country. So he had that genius idea to put the missiles in, and even, it seems like, honestly, like, it seems fair, But the U.S. did not want to. The U.S. was not all about fair. They were about national security. They wanted to protect their citizens here. So, the U.S. found out about the missiles from a spy plane. A spy plane went down and actually got a picture and saw the missiles, and the news was given to Kennedy, his advisors, and everyone, and they basically figured out that Cuba had missiles pointed right towards them. Like at any moment, without warning, they could be under attack, and that made everyone nervous. I mean, the whole entire country for that period was nervous. I mean, there was kids doing nuclear bomb like shelters like in like school, like they're doing like drills over it, which is just a crazy thought. I couldn't imagine growing up in that time period and being like nervous, like maybe is today my last day like on earth. Like it was a scary thought for many people. So yes, when so the missiles were there, and they couldn't have that. The U.S. had to find a way to get rid of these missiles. So the U.S. was thinking of a bunch of different scenarios here. They were thinking, well, should we try to invade Cuba this time with our military, not just a bunch of exiles? With I don't know if they had military training or whatnot, but should they like give it their best go with their actual military, or should they try to bomb like Cuba? Should they try to like just explode the missiles? That could have been dangerous, but honestly, cooler heads were able to prevail. I think this was a very genius idea. So Kennedy decided to implement a blockade of Cuba. So the blockade of Cuba was going to limit the Soviets coming in and out of the country, dropping off goods and stuff, and this would devastate Cuba's economy. And they have food, other goods. I mean, they have tons of goods just coming into the country from the Soviets. They are relying on the Soviets here. They need them. They need their help here. So, as when the Soviets first saw the U.S. blockade, this is when all hell could have broke loose. Every war usually has that starting, like that starting point, like the fire starts right there. Like usually they have that one moment. If you go throughout all the world wars in the history, you'll see most of them have just that one big bang, that sets the whole thing off. Tensions are extremely high, and it only takes one thing to happen to start an entire war. So this could have started it. If the Soviets tried to get through the blockade, we could be looking at a much different world right now. If the Soviet Union succeeded in taking down our ships and getting past the blockade, I'm sure there would have been a much more urgent response from Kennedy and the U.S. They would have wanted revenge, and that's when all hell probably would have broken loose. But thankfully, the Russians just moved. They saw it was coming, and they basically just decided, you know what, this is not worth it. We're just gonna go away. So the U.S. succeeded in blocking off Cuba, which is a win for them. But at this time period, I mean, nothing like you always need the conflicts, like more conflicts to start. Like the Soviets next time could bring a bunch of, like they could fly planes over. They could bring like a bunch of armored ships in. Like this conflict was nowhere near over. But thankfully, at the same time, Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy started to send letters to each other to try and think of peace. They were sending messages, which was a very important step towards peace. So they eventually decided on a good solution, I feel. So both of them take their missiles out and basically end the conflict. So the U.S. has to remove their missiles from Turkey and Greece, and the Soviets have to remove theirs from Cuba. So it honestly, I think that was a very good move for both sides. They avoided nuclear war. They avoided nuclear war. They avoided they absolutely avoided the worst of things basically to happen. Like this could have been a disaster for both these countries and the world. If a nuclear war went on, we could be in a way different world right now. Like, who knows the state of the world would have been like after a nuclear war happened. So cooler heads prevailed, and they were able to avoid the worst of the conflict. They got past the worst conflict of the Cold War. And obviously, these countries still do not like each other to this day. It's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 60s, but they don't like each other to this day. So They are not, so the conflicts were not over at this point, but the biggest one was avoided, and they were able to avoid nuclear war. So, students, that was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and be thankful that nuclear war didn't happen, or the world could be way different today. See you, class.